to Chick Corea's cheap but good advice for playing music in a group. And again, doesn't have to be a group. It can be for playing with yourself. That came out wrong. Anyway, when you're recording, composing, just playing, practicing, I think all of these things apply quite well. So we've been through 6 of these so far. I won't review for you. If you need a review, go check out the previous videos. If you have any comments, any input into your interpretations of what these rules mean, put it in the comments below. We'll have a discussion about it. That'd be super cool. Let's go now to number 7. If you play more than one instrument at a time, like a drum kit or multiple keyboards, make sure that they're balanced with one another. And this actually applies to guitar too, and bass and any instrument, quite honestly, because actually, probably with the exception of voice maybe, and even then we could find an argument for this, we're kind of playing multiple instruments at a time. The guitar has 6 strings on it, right? So it's up to us to make sure that our instrument's well set up so that, you know, everything sings as it should. We may be used to certain ways of doing it, and that's fine. You know, if we have a guitar that is uneven from top to bottom and that's part of our sound, well, that's cool too. That's balanced from your point of view, which is absolutely great. But something like drums is really important. I went to a clinic many years ago with David Garibaldi, who played with Tower of Power. And if you want to hear a definitive David Garibaldi track, listen to What Is Hip by Tower of Power. Amazing player. But one of the things he said was something that I had started to notice as a player at that point. I'd been playing for, I don't know, 5 years at that point, something like that, maybe a little more. But he called it the balance of sound on the drum kit, where it's not just about smashing things, it's about having a deliberate volume for everything. So he described it as playing your drums as if it, so it sounds like it came off of a record, in a sense, you know, so where the hi-hat's not too loud, the snare's not too loud, the kick's not too loud or quiet, you're not smashing the cymbals really hard. Everything comes out balanced just from how you play it, you know. When we record drums, it's great. We can mic everything and we have control over every aspect of the drums, at least that we mic individually. And that's great, and that's a powerful thing, but a really good drummer can sound like that anyway, and that makes things sound good. I'm biased, of course, but a good drum sound really sets up everything else to sound decent. Sometimes, even if everything else isn't sounding great, if the drummer's good and the drummer's solid and the drummer's sound is good, it makes the whole thing sound like you mean it to sound that way. And to me, that's important. Getting everything to work together, balance it all out with each other. It works completely with what we said before about making your sound blend, right? If we do that with the band, we can do that with our own instrument, but also that feeds back. If we're sensitive enough to do that with our own instrument, then we're doing that with the band too, very likely. And that idea of overall as a band is, where does everything sit in terms of its prominence in what you hear? Those are things we have control over. And again, a good band and a group of people that are working well together will do that a bit naturally, but also have the confidence and the generosity, in a sense, to accept feedback in that way. It's like, hey, can we bring that down a little bit? Hey, can you turn up a little bit? Just to get everything working together, to get that balance happening. We can do it with our instruments. Talked about drums, balancing the sound of the kit. Again, as a guitar player, these are things that I'm constantly discovering for myself. It took me a while to figure out why are my upper strings so shrill? Oh, okay, I need to A, adjust how I'm playing. B, I have to look at how my pickups are set. Lots of things about that. C, look at the tone control even. You know, it tends, on this telly, it tends to really bark when you get up into those upper strings. and you can hear the difference of each string. When I record and I listen back on a track, I can tell where I was on a string based on what the guitar sounds like. And that may be an idiosyncrasy of the guitar itself, but nonetheless, those are things that I'm responsible for, in a sense, that I need to be in control of, or at least know what's going on if I'm going to be putting guitar tracks onto things. I need to know what's happening with that guitar sound. So part of it is achieving that balance of sound, knowing, at least for this particular guitar, that I can't hit those higher strings hard in the same way that I might on a lower string, or vice versa. I'm going to have to hit the lower stuff harder to make it all blend. And that's just part of learning your instrument. And I think it's important for any instrument we do. Same with bass, right? Bass is a tough one because bass really, it's quite low, so it starts to get harder to determine what's happening easily with the ear, and yet it's capable of going up fairly high, if you're working up the fretboard. So in order for all that to work together, a good bass player has to take that into account, has to think about balancing everything so that it works, so that some things aren't jumping out too much or some things aren't disappearing under the rest of the music. Same with when we record, right? If we record things, if we're recording it, then we're really responsible for all that, and we have control over all those things in ways that even as players we might not, or we don't have as much control as we'd like. So when we're creating music in the studio, then this balance of sound is everything. I mean, that's what a mix is, basically. When we mix a song, we're balancing the sound and getting everything to blend together and to sound good together. So that's really, 6 and 7 out of this list of Chick Corea. I mean, it is so important. It's everything. It's everything that happens with recorded music. It's about getting everything to work together. Let's talk number 8. Don't make any of your music mechanically or just through patterns of habit. Create each sound, phrase, and piece with choice, deliberately. Let's read that again. Don't make any of your music mechanically or just through patterns of habit. Create each sound, phrase, and piece with choice, deliberately. Wow, that's a big one, actually. And that's so much easier said than done. In a way, it's like Chick, having been so technically accomplished for so long, I mean, it's fantastic advice, but it's hard advice for a beginner, right? Because or even an intermediate player, because we're always running this balance of mechanical technique and expression. And as we start as players, in a sense, we start with mechanical technique. If we take piano lessons as a kid, we're learning what the notes are, what key is what note, and reading music and getting our fingers in the right place and creating chords. And it's the same with guitar, right? We're learning chords. If you're going through a sort of normal guitar educational process, probably learning scales, you're learning picking techniques, all of these things, very technical things in a sense. This is the vocabulary with which we'll later express ourselves, and can sort of begin to express ourselves quite early. I mean, it's like speech, right? When you're a baby, unformed sounds, in a sense, basically crying, other sounds that don't necessarily have a lot of inherent meaning. Often we know what they're after, I'm hungry, I need my diaper changed, blah, blah, blah. But these aren't words that the baby is applying to these concepts on purpose. These are just, expressions. In a sense, a baby is just pure expression without vocabulary. The process of learning language, is incredibly complicated. So of course I'm vastly oversimplifying it here, but as a baby hears mother and father, sisters, brothers, other mother, other father, they're hearing grandparents. Let's just name all possible family members. Okay. They're hearing people around them say words, and so they start to copy these words. And so, the baby can say a word, maybe not necessarily know what it means, but that comes very quickly. We start to associate words with what the words are meant to indicate. As things go on, we develop more complicated patterns of using these words. We develop some sentences. We develop some intentionality with the words, in a sense, where it's like, pointing at things and saying the word, so we know what those things, what the word is symbolizing. We develop sentences. We develop grammar. And we go through this entire process until, ideally, we get to this place where we can express our ideas through this medium of speech to other people without constantly having to be reviewing the rules of speech while we do it, right? It would be like constantly reading a bicycle manual while we're trying to ride a bicycle. Eventually we just know how to do it, and we're just expressing bicycle riding without having to think about it. And it's the same with speech. If we have a conversation, ideally we're just expressing ourselves clearly to each other through the tools of our vocabulary, but those tools are transparent in a sense. We're not constantly looking at them, and occasionally we might have to choose a word or try and remember a word or something, but most of the time we're not thinking about grammar, we're not thinking about sentence structure, we're not thinking about subject and object and all of that stuff. Speech would be incredibly clunky if we had to do that all the time, right? There's this unconscious flow, this expression that to me is a direct analog of what we are shooting for as musicians. We want to just flow out of this instrument. This thing is pleasurable to play and fun to learn, but it should be transparent to the idea that wants to come out of wherever you feel like it comes out of, your mind, your spirit, your soul, whatever. In a way, this should not get in the way of that, right? And that's part of the process of learning the technical aspect. The technical vocabulary and the expression are very hand in hand in a sense, right? It's through that vocabulary that we can express ourselves. If we're not very well spoken, we have difficulty having an articulate conversation. And it's not because we're dumb or anything, it's just because we haven't developed the vocabulary to express those things as fully as we could have so far, right? It's the same with an instrument. Lack of technique gets in the way of expression sometimes. Does it mean that we should shred technique all the time? No, because we see the other end of that equation, that yin to the yang, right? Where we can be incredibly technical and yet have nothing to express. We're just noodling, right? There's something in the middle of that. Surf music is so interesting because surfing is like the central phenomenon of all this stuff, where if you're surfing, there's a certain place on that wave where you're either getting crashed over forward or you're going off the back of it and you're not surfing anymore. There's a certain point that you have to deliberately keep going where you're just in the right place for that wave to carry you. It's the same thing with music. It's the same thing with everything. We're surfing between technique and expression all the time. And do we ever get it perfect? Rarely, right? We get tastes of that, and that's what keeps us going, at least in my opinion. You get a taste of where it just works, and it's like, wow, I need more of that, right? But I fall in either direction. My problem is I'm not very technical, and I'm very self-taught in a sense. So whatever comes out is often crippled by lack of technique, or at least carved crudely through the lens of my poor technique. For me, the passion of the idea and the expression is the main thing. So it's like maybe I'm too lazy to sit down and build up the technique or something. I want to get into the ideas. So, it's easy to paint yourself into a corner that way too, right? That's a form of surfing that balance where you're stuck in certain places if you don't develop both sides well. So I encourage you, develop both sides well, practice hard, kids, stay in school. So one of the words that Chick used in there was habit. I think we all have these things. When you pick up your instrument, there's a thing you do. Like almost every player I've ever seen, especially guitar, but certainly drums, everything, they have something they do that's just like, oh, I'm on this instrument now, I do this, right? Maybe it's just one lick, maybe it's a series of things, but it's a mechanical thing, it's a habit. When I pick up the guitar, I hit an open E chord for some reason. It's the first chord I ever learned. I mean, it has a sort of purpose. It's like patient assessment. You know, it's like, is this thing in tune? What does it feel like? You know, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it's a habit, right? And in our playing, there are lots of those things hiding in there. If you're playing along with someone and someone says, hey, why don't you take a solo? A lot of us will drop into something almost predetermined in a way, right? A habit that we have, something that we've worked out that sounds pretty cool, you know, and the more we do it, the more we do it. And the less we don't do it, the less we don't do it. We end up doing those kinds of things a lot. We have a lot of habits. I know I do. And so it's incumbent on us, if we want to progress as musicians, as progress in the quality of expression that we can share with the world, or just do for ourselves, however you want to think of it. We want to break habits as aggressively as possible, because that gives us freedom in a sense, right? Our habits eventually build walls around us where it's hard to get out of our habits, where they narrow us into just what we're used to doing, right? What we're practiced at doing, whatever. We need to break habits. And I find, like, especially with guitar and a limited vocabulary for myself, I have a very few things that I can sort of do. And for me, my work when I'm writing music, recording music, is constantly trying to identify and break habits. It's like, oh, I always go there. Oh, I love that turn of chord. Oh, I often do this descending thing, you know, oh, I'll always do that little hammer-on thing or whatever, right? And I always want it to sound interesting for myself and surprising for myself if I can. So that's a big effort for me, is to try and identify those habits and do something else. Is it always better? Of course not, right? But that's the learning process. That's at least seeing the habit happen. Sometimes the habit, whatever our habit is, applies really well to whatever we're putting on. So, you know, it can be a habit to break our habits too, which could eventually become a dangerous habit. It's okay to have some things that work and to apply those things, because when we know where they work, then that's where they work. But again, we're surfing that boundary of, you know, habits, not habits, habits, not habits. Where do we find the place for each of those things? But in order to gain freedom in our playing as a training thing, in a sense, we want to really be attuned to finding habits and breaking them. Trying something totally crazy and different and seeing where that leads us. Experiment. That's the only way you grow, in a sense. And I think really, Chick really means that. Like, don't make your music mechanically or through patterns of habit. He says, create each sound, phrase, and piece with choice, deliberately. That doesn't mean you necessarily know what you're going to play. It doesn't mean that I know he says choice deliberately, but in a way it's almost the opposite of that too, where it's okay to go out into unexplored territory where you don't know where you are, to turn off the lights and walk through the room anyway. Those things are things that develop confidence in our own playing and our own abilities to express. And I think they're important things to do. Do they always work? Of course not. Improvisation generally is, you know, moments of pure magic and moments of complete, utter disaster, right? And it's only through doing those things in a way that we really learn what works and what doesn't. So to me, it's like, find your habits, bust them, find them, bust them. Do the opposite of what you want to do sometimes. Is that contradicting play what you hear? Yeah, but no, because, yeah, play what you initially hear. But if you hear your habit go, what could not be your habit? Think about that. What would that sound like? Let's try playing that. So that's playing what we hear too, right? It all means everything. It all means nothing. I'm glad I could be so much help here on Creative Waves on the Pi Records Intergalactic YouTube Network.